Look, I better say who I am, because otherwise why am I sitting here, you know? Because none of you guys know me, I think, and so I better make some kind of justification for being the person in this chair. It could perhaps better be any of you guys. Well, I mean, the first thing is we're friends, you know, as you are, I think most of you anyway, and perhaps some ex-colleagues as well. But there are more specific things as well. I worked at Fort Hare in the Eastern Cape for 10 years, and John was there fairly briefly, but we interacted then, overlapped then. And later on, John worked with my wife in the CHE, the Commission on Higher Education. So there's quite a lot of links between our families. But of course, mainly, as Cicely said, I was involved with two student colleagues, Dr. Brown Maba and unfortunately the late Loisa Pulamani, in work on SOMAFCO, and John was one of our interviewees, and an extraordinarily good one. He contributed a lot to the final book. I'll say, when you've read this book, you'll get more insights into SOMAFCO, to this extraordinary ANC school in Tanzania in the 70s and 80s. So that's why I'm here. Great, good. So I'm going to ask, as Cicely said, I'm going to ask a few questions, which John can, respond to, and at the end we'll throw it open to you guys. So I'm going to start by asking you, John, can you give us a sort of a brief idea of what this book is about, so that we can sort of set the stage for these guys and myself to ask further questions?
I think a memoir is a slice of history from someone's point of view, about their family, could be about a car they built. Memoir is historical account. So this is historical account of the struggle, but not the one you're thinking of against apartheid. It's the struggle between me and Ntombi. So when she met me, she was highly irritated by me, but somehow we fell in love. It's explained in the book, a bit to do with an oyster and all grains of sand and a pearl. See if you make sense of it. So that love has just grown despite us finding each other more and more irritating, disagreeing about many things violently, almost every day. Yet somehow the love grows, so I had to explain it. That's the motive. And then on the way to being me, and she says, I am almost unique amongst male mammals, mammalian, whether it's a dog, a pig, it's a mammal, it's a male, because I lack balls and I don't have a backbone. If you study biology, you know all mammals have backbones, even non-mammals, and they all have testes. But anyway, then she says, evidence of this is in my job. I run and please my bosses. I fawn like a puppy around their legs, And so this is, she's a very strong character. I'm a weak and imaginative one. So it's explaining how two people are so different. One from a deep rural Zulu background and a peasant who wants to farm all her life and has never been able to because of apartheid and other things. And me, I dwell in books. I don't live in reality. Can you imagine how much I irritate her? And that's where the sense of humor comes. It goes through the book. It's my survival mechanism, A. B, it irritates the hell out of Ntombi, which I like, It's my main weapon to survive and to irritate her. So I think that sums up, the book is to explain it. But in explaining that, I have to explain the whole world, colonialism, our childhoods, our family histories. So on the way to explaining that, I must explain the context we live in. And a bit of poetry, a bit of philosophy, and a bit of humor. And somehow kind of finds itself one book, but it's impossible to know which shelf in the bookshop to to really look for it in. I don't know if that sums it up.
No, I think it sums it up very well. I mean, for those of us who've read the book now, you know, marriages are they? They're not always that sort of romantic marriage of two minds. They're very often contrasting characters, you know, who somehow both argue but also set each other off. And I think that's what John's achieved in writing this book, remarkably, really, and honestly too, which is not easy to write honestly. In fact, that was going to be my next question. I'm going to press you a little bit more about that, John. It's a very self-critical book, and you have just been very self-critical and humorous as well, which is a nice combination. Most people, I think, wouldn't sort of, is this fair? Wouldn't sort of hang themselves out to dry, if you like, quite as you do. I'm not sure that I would be able to write in that way. Why did you approach it in that way? Could you say a little more about your own self-revelation, if you like, in this book?
Well, is this on? I think so.
So,
Yes? No?
can hear you.
Hello? Oh, that's better. Okay, so essentially I have a quite sensitive conscience, in fact a very sensitive conscience. So if I do something I think is wrong or bad, I suffer a lot. And it doesn't do the person any good that I injured. But they won't, you know, don't even say I'm suffering, does it make you feel better? I tried that once only. So I feel terrible about things I've done, then I try and repair. So with Ntombi, I didn't appreciate, as I say, I live in my own world. When we came back to South Africa, I became addicted to work and stress. And I made other people addicted, like Siegler now, you see. It is addictive. And I chose the most difficult parts of the state to work in, the Eastern Cape. I headed up building, planning, and curriculum and other parts of the education system there at a chief director level. Home Affairs is not the easiest department. It's got a budget of 5 billion. It needs 20 billion in order to be a proper Home Affairs, and so forth. So I find the work interesting, demanding, but it was terrible for Ntombi. In fact, she sent me a recording to play you guys. If there's time, I'll play it 2-3 minutes. She says, we somehow stuck together and survived, but you dragged us through about 5 different houses in South Africa, and she's a peasant. She builds the houses, she develops them. Then I sell them for nothing, move to the next job. And the children's education and health and so on start suffering. So there I have a terrible conscience, and how better to get out of my conscience by inflicting the miserable story on all of you. So that is what, you know, it's expiation, if that's the correct term, and I could like confessing. There you go.
Okay, great. Well, actually, I want to be a bit more, bring that into a closer focus on that, John. It wouldn't be right to discuss the book without discussing the struggle, in which you played a significant part, especially in education. But you also talk about, and perhaps this is just building on what you've already said, you've got a chapter called abandonment, a rather forlorn word, I think. And it's not just about your own personal life and Ntombi's life, I think, but it's also about your parents' life, who, as I'm sure most or perhaps all of you know, John's parents were Communist Party members, and at a time when that was extremely difficult, and were in jail, your father, and maltreated in all sorts of ways, psychologically and even physically. Could you say a little more, perhaps, about let's call it that, the costs of, perhaps particularly the costs for white people who were in a tiny minority in their own community with their political beliefs, who took these sorts of stands, and the effects of this on your family, on yourself perhaps, and at more distance on Ntombi perhaps. Actually, sorry, before you get there, there's a. I want to just read a bit here, if I may. Is that all right? Yeah. A paragraph, page. I better put my glasses on. Yeah, being middle class and caught up in the same war, and with most of the white working class being deeply racist, I was hardly aware of the emotional strain on my father. Nor did I ever think of his mother and father as my grandparents. I once had a glimpse of a thin woman in a photo he kept somewhere, who I assumed was his mother. After his release from prison and when we were living in exile together in London, he received a letter saying she had died. He lay on his bed and quietly cried, and nobody comforted him. The memory still fills me with shame and regret. I mean, I find that very moving, and again, as so much of this book, it's you being very honest about something which is difficult. But it does lead me back to my question about the effects on individual families, and in this case, white families who were involved in the struggle, and the psychic costs of that.
Well, it's interesting because Ntombi and I were married for more than 1983 to 94, and then back in South Africa, we still didn't know about each other's childhoods. Then I realized two things. Many couples, regardless of where they are, who they are, don't know about each other's childhoods. It's something you somehow don't tell your partner, what the teacher did to you in the 3rd grade or whatever, or did for you. And also, very few people write about their relationship with their spouse. I looked long and hard to find another memoir. So those are two things, and I wonder why that is. But abandonment for both of us was serious. And I had a romantic notion that for black people it was wonderful during the struggle, because although they were tortured, killed, shot, all of that, they had each other in those crowded townships. And Ntombi's history makes it quite clear that they parts of their family shunned them. The fact of the matter, my father also went on the treason trial, so he was away from the house. I never knew why. So this was before I was in the struggle. I was recruited by Chris Hani when I was like 1969 or so, 70. We were both affected by the struggle as children, and then we got to be part of the struggle, a totally different thing. So abandonment is more for the impact as a child. But once you're in the struggle, there's huge compensations. You link with other people, the anti-apartheid movement, you feel part of something. So yeah, but the abandonment on both of us was terrible. She was in a Catholic boarding school in Swaziland, where she had 1 can of sardines, 1 bar of soap a year, and her father didn't give her anything. So she literally hungry all the time, scraping, learning how to make do. Where I was in a posh private school by virtue of the Cadbury family felt sorry for me and put me through school. They had a couple of members in South Africa who knew us. So there I was in my rich school, but both feeling extremely lonely. I would wait hours for my sister to come from London every month to visit me. So both of us were, her less lonely in a sense, surrounded by in Swaziland, in Africa. Me amongst the British, being white, I was still found the British totally alien. There's some very nice stories where I got the British culture completely wrong. But there again, when we were a bit more mature, both of us felt closer to the people in the town called Sunderland than you ever did in London, where you hardly meet a British person, you meet other South Africans. Right. So abandonment, it affected us both as children very dreadfully. It scars children for life. They become insecure, and it has effects. And it's interesting that it had similar effects on both of us.
Yes. Yeah. Thanks, John. I'll probably make this the last question, because I think it should be over to you. Is that okay with you, Cecily? Yeah. In fact, I want to pick up what you said about Sunderland. I mean, I'm not British, I'm Irish, but I know England fairly well, and slightly the north of England too, and also London. Yeah, I mean, Sunderland is a sort of a hard-scrabble working-class town, small city, I suppose, amongst others like Newcastle and so on in the north of England. Very different, as John rightly says, to the sophisticated London. What can I say? More Krugersdorp than Cape Town, I think. But I think I pick up from your book that actually when you went to Sunderland, the two of you, all of you in fact, kids by then of course, you actually related to the place and found it interesting, warm-hearted in many ways, in spite of the racism and so on that you also pick up on, which I suppose you find in many places. Do you ever regret? I mean, it's a different future that you never made for yourselves. But do you ever feel, I could have lived there, I could have stayed there, I could have become part of that community, or did you always know that you were coming back to this country, the two of you?
Well, many exiles are still abroad. They never came back.
Exactly.
But I felt a romantic attachment to the idea of South Africa, liberation, building a new society. And Ntombi said, but why didn't you get an English passport? Because I was romantic, I thought it would be somehow disloyal. And now I regret, you know. I have to pay how much for a visa to get to England? So almost every other South African, from communists through to whoever, acquired British citizenship. I refused. So I'm still this romantic dreamer that Ntombi says, no, but you rushed to get back home in South Africa. You sold our car cheap, you sold our cottage cheap, you sold all our kitchen utensils. Now you work in this miserable junior lecture. You thought you would be someone. We can't afford to buy a frying pan. There at UCT where I lectured, I'm hunting, and she used a wonderful expression, like a cat in the night amongst the second-hand shops for an old pot I can use to bake bread in. And up till now, every other day, she reminds me of what I did to those pots that my mother gave her. You know, she's very, very long memory, and my memory is very short. So the memoir's all her memories. I can't remember a thing. That's what stress does for you. But I don't know, Sunderland is a special place, but it's changed. So when we lived in an old part of town with stones, cobblestones, and a row of houses, all joined at the hip, so to speak, 100-year-old cottages. And the children were in and out of each other's houses. I mean, almost like a British equivalent of a township.
Yes.
And that was very special. And the people were welcoming. But they, of course, being working class, they robbed me blind. This dozy twat from who knows where, you know. They'd sell him a crap car. You know. The car went like this on one side because it was wrecked. But never mind, it taught me a lot of lessons.
Yeah, it's an England that not that many people, visitors, see actually, and it's worth seeing actually. It is, and experiencing. Look, I've got other questions here, but I think it's over to you guys now, really.